Chapters 3 and 4 of Book 12 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo.
Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 12, Corinth. Chapter 3. Night begins to descend upon Grantaire.
The spot was, in fact, admirably adapted. The entrance to the street widened out, the other extremity narrowed together into a pocket without exit.
Corinth created an obstacle. The Rue Mondétour was easily barricaded on the right and the left. No attack was possible, except from the Rue Saint-Denis, that is to say, in front and in full sight. Bossuet had the comprehensive glance of a fasting Hannibal. Terror had seized on the whole street at the irruption of the mob. There was not a passer-by who did not get out of sight. In the space of a flash of lightning, in the rear, to the right and left, shops, stables, area doors, windows, blinds, attic skylights, shutters of every description were closed, from the ground floor to the roof. A terrified old woman fixed a mattress in front of her window on two clothes poles for drying linen, in order to deaden the effect of musketry. The wine shop alone remained open, and that for a very good reason, that the mob had rushed into it. "Ah, my God! Ah, my God!" sighed Mame Hucheloup. Bossuet had gone down to meet Courfeyrac. Joly, who had placed himself at the window, exclaimed, "Courfeyrac, you ought to have brought an umbrella. You will catch gold." In the meantime, in the space of a few minutes, 20 iron bars had been wrenched from the grated front of the wine shop. 10 fathoms of street had been unpaved. Gavroche and Bahorel had seized in its passage and overturned the dray of a lime dealer named Ancot. This dray contained 3 barrels of lime, which they placed beneath the piles of paving stones. Enjolras raised the cellar trap, and all the widow Hucheloup's empty casks were used to flank the barrels of lime. Julie, with his fingers skilled in painting the delicate sticks of fans, had backed up the barrels and the dray with 2 massive heaps of blocks of rough stone, blocks which were improvised like the rest and procured no one knows where. The beams which served as props were torn from the neighboring house fronts and laid on the casks. When Bossuet and Courfeyrac turned round, half the street was already barred with a rampart higher than a man. There is nothing like the hand of the populace for building everything that is built by demolishing.
Matelote and Gibelotte had mingled with the workers.
Gibelotte went and came loaded with rubbish. Her lassitude helped on the barricade. She served the barricade as she had served wine, with a sleepy air. An omnibus with 2 white horses passed the end of the street. Bossuet strode over the paving stones, ran to it, stopped the driver, made the passengers alight, offered his hand to the ladies, dismissed the conductor, and returned, leading the vehicle and the horses by the bridle. "Omnibuses," he said, "do not pass Corinth. Non licet omnibus adire Corinthum." An instant later, the horses were unharnessed and went off at their will through the Rue Mondétour, and the omnibus lying on its side completed the bar across the street. Mame Hucheloup, quite upset, had taken refuge in the first story. Her eyes were vague and stared without seeing anything, and she cried in a low tone. Her terrified shrieks did not dare emerge from her throat. "The end of the world has come," she muttered. Joly deposited a kiss on Mame Hucheloup's fat, red, wrinkled neck, and said to Grantaire, "My dear fellow, I have always regarded a woman's neck as an infinitely delicate thing." But Grantaire attained the highest regions of dithyramb. Matelote had mounted to the first floor once more. Grantaire seized her round the waist, and gave vent to long bursts of laughter at the window. "Matelote is homely," he cried. "Matelote is a dream of ugliness. Matelote is a chimera. This is the secret of her birth. A Gothic Pygmalion, who was making gargoyles for cathedrals, fell in love with one of them, the most horrible, one fine morning. He besought love to give it life, and this produced Matelote. Look at her, citizens. She has chromate of lead-colored hair like Titian's mistress, and she is a good girl. I guarantee she will fight well. Every good girl contains a hero. As for Mother Hucheloup, she's an old warrior. Look at her mustaches. She inherited them from her husband. A hussar indeed. She will fight too. These two alone will strike terror to the heart of the banlieue. Comrades, we shall overthrow the government as true as there are 15 intermediary acids between margaric acid and formic acid. However, that is a matter of perfect indifference to me. Gentlemen, my father always detested me because I could not understand mathematics. I understand only love and liberty. I am Grantaire, the good fellow. Having never had any money, I never acquired the habit of it, and the result is that I have never lacked it. But if I had been rich, there would have been no more poor people. You would have seen. Oh, if the kind hearts only had fat purses, how much better things would go. I picture myself Jesus Christ with Rothschild's fortune. How much good he would do. Matelote, embrace me. You are voluptuous and timid. You have cheeks which invite the kiss of a sister, and lips which claim the kiss of a lover. Hold your tongue, you cask, said Courfeyrac. Grantaire retorted, I am the Capitoul and the master of the floral games. Enjolras, who was standing on the crest of the barricade, gun in hand, raised his beautiful, austere face. Enjolras, as the reader knows, has something of the Spartan and of the Puritan in his composition. He would have perished at Thermopylae and Leonidas, and burned at Drogheda and Cromwell. Grantaire, he shouted, go get rid of the fumes of your wine somewhere else than here. This is the place for enthusiasm, not for drunkenness. Don't disgrace the barricade. This angry speech produced a singular effect on Grantaire. One would have said that he had had a glass of cold water flung in his face. He seemed to be rendered suddenly sober. He sat down, put his elbows on a table near the window, looked at Enjolras with indescribable gentleness, and said to him, Let me sleep here. Go and sleep somewhere else, cried Enjolras. But Grantaire, still keeping his tender and troubled eyes fixed on him, replied, Let me sleep here until I die. Enjolras regarded him with disdainful eyes. Grantaire, you are incapable of believing, of thinking, of willing, of living, and of dying. Grantaire replied in a grave tone, You will see. He stammered a few more unintelligible words, then his head fell heavily on the table, and, as is the usual effect of the second period of inebriety into which Enjolras had roughly and abruptly thrust him, an instant later he had fallen asleep.
Chapter 4. An attempt to console the widow Hucheloup. Bahorel, in ecstasies over the barricade, shouted, Here's the street in its low-necked dress. How well it looks! Courfeyrac, as he demolished the wine-shop to some extent, sought to console the widowed proprietress. Mother Hucheloup, weren't you complaining the other day because you had had a notice served on you for infringing the law, because Gibelotte shook a counterpane out of your window?
Yes, my good Monsieur Courfeyrac. Ah, good heavens! Are you going to put the table of mine in your horror, too? And it was for the counterpane, and also for the pot of flowers which fell from the attic window into the street, that the government collected a fine of 100 francs. If that isn't an abomination, what is? Well, Mother Hucheloup, we are avenging you. Mother Hucheloup did not appear to understand very clearly the benefit which she was to derive from the reprisals made on her account. She was satisfied after the manner of that Arab woman, who, having received a box on the ear from her husband, went to complain to her father, and cried for vengeance, saying, "Father, you owe my husband affront for affront." The father asked, "On which cheek did you receive the blow?" "On the left cheek." The father slapped her right cheek and said, "Now you are satisfied. Go tell your husband that he boxed my daughter's ears, and I have accordingly boxed his wife's." The rain had ceased. Recruits had arrived. Workmen had brought under their blouses a barrel of powder, a basket containing bottles of vitriol, 2 or 3 carnival torches, and a basket filled with fire-pots, left over from the King's festival. This festival was very recent, having taken place on the 1st of May. It was said that these munitions came from a grocer in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine named Pepin. They smashed the only street lantern in the Rue de la Chanvrerie, the lantern corresponding to one in the Rue Saint-Denis, and all the lanterns in the surrounding street, de Mondétour, de Cygne, de Précieuse, and de la Grande, and de la Petite Truanderie. Enjolras, Combeferre, and Courfeyrac directed everything. 2 barricades were now in the process of construction at once, both of them resting on the Corinth House and forming a right angle. The larger shut off the Rue de la Chanvrerie, the other closed the Rue Mondétour on the side of the Rue de Cygne. This last barricade, which was very narrow, was constructed only of casts and paving stones. There were about 50 workers on it. 30 were armed with guns, for on their way they had effected a wholesale loan from an armourer's shop. Nothing could be more bizarre, and at the same time more motley, than this troop. One had a round jacket, a cavalry sabre, and 2 holster pistols. Another was in his shirt-sleeves with a round hat and a powder horn slung at his side. A third wore a plastron of 9 sheets of grey paper and was armed with a saddler's awl. There was one who was shouting, "Let us exterminate them to the last man and die at the point of our bayonet." This man had no bayonet. Another spread out his coat, the cross-belt and cartridge box of a National Guardsman, the cover of a cartridge box being ornamented with this inscription in red worsted, "Public Order." There were a great many guns bearing the numbers of the legions, few hats, no cravats, many bare arms, some pikes. Add to this all ages, all sorts of faces, small, pale young men, and bronzed longshoremen. All were in haste, and as they helped each other, they discussed the possible chances. That they would receive succor about 3 o'clock in the morning. They were sure of one regiment, that Paris would rise. Terrible sayings with which was mingled a sort of cordial joviality. One would have pronounced them brothers, but they did not know each other's names. Great perils have this fine characteristic, that they bring to light the fraternity of strangers. A fire had been lighted in the kitchen, and there they were engaged in molding into bullets pewter mugs, spoons, forks, and all the brass tableware of the establishment. In the midst of it all, they drank. Caps and buckshot were mixed pell-mell on the tables with glasses of wine. In the billiard hall, Mame Hucheloup, Matelote, and Gibelotte, variously modified by terror, which had stupefied one, rendered another breathless, and roused the third, were tearing up old dishcloths and making lint. 3 insurgents were assisting them, 3 bushy-haired, jolly blades with beards and mustaches, who plucked away at the linen with fingers of seamstresses and who made them tremble. The man of lofty stature, whom Courfeyrac, Combeferre, and Enjolras had observed at the moment when he joined the mob at the corner of the Rue des Billettes, was at work on the small barricade and was making himself useful there. Gavroche was working on the larger one. As for the young man who had been waiting for Courfeyrac at his lodgings and who had inquired for Monsieur Marius, he had disappeared at about the time when the omnibus had been overturned. Gavroche, completely carried away and radiant, had undertaken to get everything in readiness. He went, came, mounted, descended, remounted, whistled, and sparkled. He seemed to be there for the encouragement of all. Had he any incentive? Yes, certainly, his poverty. Had he wings? Yes, certainly, his joy. Gavroche was a whirlwind. He was constantly visible. He was incessantly audible. He filled the air as he was everywhere at once. He was a sort of almost irritating ubiquity. No halt was possible with him. The enormous barricade felt him on its haunches. He troubled the loungers. He excited the idle. He reanimated the weary. He grew impatient over the thoughtful. He inspired gaiety in some, and breath in others, wrath in others, movement in all, now pricking a student, now biting an artisan. He alighted, paused, flew off again, hovered over the tumult, and the effort sprang from one party to another, murmuring and humming and harassing the whole company, a fly on the immense revolutionary coach. Perpetual motion was in his little arms, and perpetual clamor in his little lungs. Courage! More paving stones, more cats, more machines! Where are you now? A hod of plaster for me to stop this hole with. Your barricade is very small. It must be carried up. Put everything on it. Fling everything there. Stick it all in. Break down the house. A barricade is Mother Gibot's tea. Hello, here's a glass door. This elicited an exclamation from the workers. A glass door? What do you expect us to do with a glass door, tubercle? Hercules yourselves, retorted Gavroche. A glass door is an excellent thing in a barricade. It does not prevent an attack, but it prevents the enemy taking it, so you're never prigged apples over a wall when there are broken bottles? A glass door cuts the horns of the National Guard when they try to mount the barricade. Pardi, glass is a treacherous thing. Well, you haven't a very wildly lively imagination, comrades. However, he was furious over his triggerless pistol. He went from one to another demanding, A gun! I want a gun! Why don't you give me a gun? Give you a gun? Said Combeferre. Come now, said Gavroche. Why not? I had one in 1830 when we had a dispute with Charles X. And Enjolras shrugged his shoulders. When there are enough for men, we'll give some to the children. Gavroche wheeled round haughtily and answered, If you are killed before me, I shall take yours. Gammon, said Enjolras. Greenhorn, said Gavroche. A dandy who had lost his way and who lounged past the end of the street created a diversion. Gavroche shouted to him, Come with us, young fellow. Well now, don't we do anything for this old country of ours? The dandy fled. End of Book 12, Chapter 4.
Chapters 5 and 6 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 12, Corinth. Chapter 5, Preparations. The journals of the day, which said that that nearly impregnable structure of the barricade of the Rue de la Chanvrerie, as they call it, reached to the level of the first floor, were mistaken. The fact is that it did not exceed an average height of 6 or 7 feet. It was built in such a manner that the combatants could, at their will, either disappear behind it or dominate the barrier and even scale its crest by means of a quadruple row of paving stones placed on top of each other and arranged as steps in the interior. On the outside, the front of the barricade, composed of piles of paving stones and casks bound together by beams and planks, which were entangled in the wheels of Anco's dray and of the overturned omnibus, had a bristling and inextricable aspect. An aperture large enough to allow a man to pass through had been made between the wall of the house and the extremity of the barricade, which was furthest from the wine-shop, so that an exit was possible at this point. The pole of the omnibus was placed upright and held up with ropes, and a red flag, fastened to this pole, floated over the barricade. The little Mondétour barricade, hidden behind the wine-shop building, was not visible. The two barricades united formed a veritable redoubt, and Enjolras and Courfeyrac had not thought fit to barricade the other fragment of the Rue Mondétour, which opens through the Rue des Prêcheurs and issue into the Halles, wishing, no doubt, to preserve a possible communication with the outside, and not entertaining much fear of an attack through the dangerous and difficult street of the Rue des Prêcheurs. With the exception of this issue, which was left free, and which constituted what Follade, in his strategical style, would have termed a branch, and taking into account also the narrow cutting arranged on the Rue de la Chanvrerie, the interior of the barricade, where the wine-shop formed a salient angle, presented an irregular shape, closed on all sides. There existed an interval of 20 paces between the grand barrier and the lofty houses which formed the background of the street, so that one might say that the barricade rested on these houses, all inhabited, but closed from top to bottom. All this work was performed without any hindrance, in less than an hour, and without this handful of bold men seeing a single bearskin cap or a single bayonet make their appearance. The very bourgeois, who still ventured at this hour of riot to enter the Rue Saint-Denis, cast a glance at the Rue de la Chanvrerie, caught sight of the barricade, and redoubled their pace. The two barricades being finished, and the flag run up, a table was dragged out of the wine-shop, and Courfeyrac mounted on the table. Enjolras brought the square coffer, and Courfeyrac opened it. This coffer was filled with cartridges. When the mob saw the cartridges, a tremor ran through the bravest, and a momentary silence ensued. Courfeyrac distributed them with a smile. Each one received 30 cartridges. Many had powder, and set about making others with the bullets which they had run. As for the barrel of powder, it stood on the table on one side, near the door, and was held in reserve. The alarm beat, which ran through all Paris, did not cease, but it had finally come to be nothing more than a monotonous noise to which they no longer paid any attention. This noise retreated at times, and again drew near with melancholy undulations. They loaded the guns and carbines all together without haste, with solemn gravity. Enjolras went and stationed 3 sentinels outside the barricades, on the Rue de la Chanvrerie, the second in the Rue des Prêcheurs, the third at the corner of the Rue de la Petite Truanderie. Then, the barricades having been built, the posts assigned, the guns loaded, the sentinels stationed, they waited, alone in those redoubtable streets, through which no one passed any longer, surrounded by those dumb houses which seemed dead, and in which no human movement palpitated, enveloped in the deepening shades of twilight, which was drawing on, in the midst of that silence through which something could be felt advancing, and which had about it something tragic and terrifying, isolated, armed, determined, and tranquil. Chapter 6. Waiting. During those hours of waiting, what did they do? We must needs tell, since this is a matter of history. While the men made bullets and the women lint, while a large saucepan of melted brass and lead, destined to the bullet mold, smoked over a glowing brazier, while the sentinels watched, weapon in hand, on the barricade, while Enjolras, whom it was impossible to divert, kept an eye on the sentinels, Combeferre, Courfeyrac, Jean Prouvaire, Feuilly, Bossuet, Joly, Bahorel, and some others, sought each other out, and united as in the most peaceful days of their conversations in their student life, and, in one corner of this wine-shop, which had been converted into a casement, a couple of paces distant from the redoubt which they had built, with their carbines loaded and primed, resting against the backs of their chairs, these fine young fellows, so close to a supreme hour, began to recite love verses. What verses? These. Vous rappelez-vous notre douce vie, lorsque nous étions si gentils deux, et que nous n'avions à cœur d'autre envie que d'être bien mis est d'être amoureux. Le cul en ajoutant votre âge à mon âge, nous ne computons pas à 40 ans. Et que dans notre humble et petit ménage, toute même l'hiver nous attend printemps. Beau jour, Manuel était fier et sage. Paris s'assied à dessein banquet. Faut lancer la fondre et votre corsage avait une épingle où j'ai même piqué. Tu vous contemplez, avocat sans causer. Quand je vous menais après le dîner, vous étiez joli au point que le rosé, mais faisions la fait de se retourner. Je l'ai entendu dire, et elle belle, comme elles sont bonnes. Quels cheveux à fleurs. Sous son mantelet, elle cache une aile. Son bonnet, charmant, est à peine éclos. J'irai avec tu, pressant ton bras souple, les personnes croyant que le mot charmait. Ave Marie, dans notre heureux couple, les du mois d'avril à bon mois de mai. Nous vivions cachés, comptant porte-clous, dévorant l'amour bon fruit défendu. Ma bouche n'avait pas dit une chose, que déjà tout cœur avait répondu. Le second était le doigt bucolique. Oh, j'ai t'adoré du soir à matin. C'est ainsi qu'une amie amoureuse appliquée. La crainte du tendre épée latin. Ô place mon belle, ô place d'enfant, quand dans le tendit frais et printanier, tu tirais ton bras sur ta jambe fine, je voyais une astray au fond du grenier. J'ai foutu le planton, mais rien ne me reste, mieux que mes branches et que la monnaie. Tu m'as démontré la bonne céleste, avec une fleur que tu m'as donnée. Je t'obéissais, tu m'étais soumise. Au grenier doré, tes lacets, tes voix, allaient en venir dès l'aube en chemise, mirant ton jeune front à ton vu miroir, et qui danse pourrait prendre la mémoire de ces temps d'orée et des firmaments, des rubans, des fleurs, des gaz et des moires. Oh, l'amour baguait un agate charmant. Nos jardins étaient un pot de tulipes. Tu masquais la vitre avec un jupon. Je prenais le bol de terre des pipes, et je te donnais la tasse et jupon. Et ces grands milieux qui nous faisions rire, ton méchant brûlé, ton boa perdu, et ces chers portraits du divin Shakespeare, qu'un soir pour soupir, nous avons vendu. Je t'ai mendiant, et tu charitable. J'abassais à vol tes bras frais et ronds. Dans tes in-folio, nous servions de table, pour manger gagnant et sans déméron. La première fois que moi, joyeux bouge, j'ai pris une bassier à ta livre infus. Quand tu tiens à lait décoiffé et rouge, j'ai resté tout pâle et j'ai cru indu. Te rappelles-tu nos bonheurs sans nombre, et tous ces fichus changés et chiffons, au cœur des soupirs et nuques pleines d'ombre, se sont envolés dans les cieux profondes. Translation. Do you remember our sweet life, when we were both so young, and when we had no other desire in our hearts than to be well dressed and in love? When, by adding your age to my age, we could not count 40 years between us, and when, in our humble and tiny household, everything was spring to us even in winter. Fair days! Manuel was proud and wise. Paris sat at sacred banquets. Foy launched thunderbolts. And your corsage had a pin on which I pricked myself. Everything gazed upon you. A briefless lawyer, when I took you to the Prado to dine, you were so beautiful that the roses seemed to me to turn round, and I heard them say, "Is she not beautiful? How good she smells! What billowing hair! Beneath her mantle she hides a wing. Her charming bonnet is hardly unfolded." I wandered with thee, pressing thy supple arm. The passers-by thought that love bewitched had wedded, in our happy couple, the gentle month of April to the fair month of May. We lived concealed, content, with closed doors, devouring love, that sweet forbidden fruit. My mouth had not uttered a thing, when thy heart had already responded. The Sorbonne was the bucolic spot where I adored thee from eve till morn. 'Tis thus that an amorous soul applies the chart of the tender to the Latin country. O place Maubert, O place Dauphine, when in the fresh spring-like hut thou didst draw thy stocking on thy delicate leg, I saw a star in the depths of the garret. I have read a great deal of Plato, but nothing of it remains by me. Better than Malebranche and than the Manet, thou didst demonstrate to me celestial goodness. With the flower which thou gavest me, I obeyed thee. Thou didst submit to me, O gilded garret, to lace thee, to behold thee going and coming from dawn in thy chemise, gazing at thy young brow in thine ancient mirror. And who, when, would forego the memory of those days of aurora, and that firmament of flowers, of gauze, and of more, when love stammers a charming slang? Our gardens consisted of a pot of tulips. Thou didst mask the window with thy petticoat. I took the earthenware bowl and gave thee the Japanese cup. And those great misfortunes which made us laugh, thy cuff scorched, thy boa lost, and that dear portrait of the divine Shakespeare, which we sold one evening that we might sup. I was a beggar, and thou wert charitable. I kissed thy fresh round arms in haste. A folio Dante served us as a table on which to eat merrily a centime's worth of chestnuts. The first time that, in my joyous den, I snatched a kiss from thy fiery lip, when thou wentest forth, dishevelled and blushing, I turned deathly pale, and I believed in God. Dost thou recall our innumerable joys, and all those fiches changed to rags? Oh, what sighs from our hearts full of gloom fluttered forth to the heavenly depths! The hour, the spot, these souvenirs of youth recalled, a few stars which began to twinkle in the sky, the funeral repose of those deserted streets, the imminence of the inexorable adventure, which was in preparation, gave a pathetic charm to these verses murmured in a low tone in the dust by Jean Prouvaire, who, as we have seen, was a gentle poet. In the meantime a lamp had been lighted in the small barricade, and in the large one of those wax torches, such as are to be met with on Shrove Tuesday, in front of vehicles loaded with masks, on their way to La Courtille. These torches, as the reader has seen, came from Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The torch had been placed in a sort of cage of paving stones, closed on three sides to shelter it from the wind, and disposed in such a fashion that all the light fell on the flag. The street and the barricade remained sunk in gloom, and nothing was to be seen except the red flag formidably illuminated as by an enormous dark lantern. This light enhanced the scarlet of the flag with an indescribable and terrible purple. End of Book 12, Chapter 6. Chapters 7 and 8 of Book 12 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 12, Corinth. Chapter 7. The man recruited in the Rue de Billette. Night was fully come. Nothing made its appearance. All that they heard was confused noises, and at intervals fusillades. But these were rare, badly sustained, and distant. This respite, which was thus prolonged, was a sign that the government was taking its time and collecting its forces. These 50 men were waiting for 60,000. Enjolras felt attacked by that impatience which seizes on strong souls on the threshold of redoubtable events. He went in search of Gavroche, who had set to making cartridges in the tap-room by the dubious light of 2 candles placed on the counter by way of precaution, on account of the powder which was scattered on the tables. These 2 candles cast no gleam outside. The insurgents had, moreover, taken pains not to have any light in the upper stories. Gavroche was deeply preoccupied at the moment, but not precisely with his cartridges. The man of the Rue de Billette had just entered the tap-room, and had seated himself at the table which was the least lighted. A musket of large model had fallen into his share, and he held it between his legs. Gavroche, who had been, up to that moment, distracted by 100 amusing things, had not even seen this man. When he entered, Gavroche followed him mechanically with his eyes, admiring his gun. Then, all at once, when the man was seated, the street urchin sprang to his feet. Anyone who had spied upon that man up to that moment would have seen that he was observing everything in the barricade and in the band of insurgents with singular attention. But from the moment when he had entered this room, he had fallen into a sort of brown study, and no longer seemed to see anything that was going on. The gamin approached this pensive personage, and began to step around him on tiptoe, as one walks in the vicinity of a person whom one is afraid of waking. At the same time, over his childish countenance, which was at once so impudent and so serious, so giddy and so profound, so gay and so heartbreaking, passed all those grimaces of an old man which signify, "Ah, bah, impossible, my sight is bad, I am dreaming, can this be? No, it is not, but yes, why no," etc. Gavroche balanced on his heels, clenched both fists in his pockets, moved his neck around like a bird, expended in a gigantic pout all the sagacity of his lower lip. He was astounded, uncertain, incredulous, convinced, dazzled. He had the mien of the chief of the eunuchs in the slave mart, discovering a Venus among the blowsy females, and the air of an amateur recognizing a Raphael in a heap of daubs. His whole being was at work, the instinct which scents out and the intelligence which combines. It was evident that a great event had happened in Gavroche's life. It was at the most intense point of this preoccupation that Enjolras accosted him. "You are small," said Enjolras. "You will not be seen. Go out of the barricade, slip along close to the houses, skirmish about a bit in the streets, and come back and tell me what is going on." Gavroche raised himself on his haunches. "So the little chaps are good for something. That's very lucky. I'll go. In the meanwhile, trust to the little fellows, and distrust the big ones." And Gavroche, raising his head and lowering his voice, added, as he indicated the man of the Rue de Billette, "Do you see that big fellow there?" "Well?" "He's a police spy." "Are you sure of it?" "It isn't 2 weeks since he pulled me off the cornice of the Port Royal, where I was taking the air, by my ear." Enjolras hastily quitted the urchin, and murmured a few words in a very low tone to a longshoreman from the wine docks who chanced to be at hand. The man left the room and returned almost immediately, accompanied by 3 others. The four men, four porters, with broad shoulders, went and placed themselves, without doing anything to attract his attention, behind the table on which the man of the Rue des Billettes was leaning with his elbows. They were evidently ready to hurl themselves upon him. When Enjolras approached the man and demanded of him, "Who are you?" At this abrupt query the man started. He plunged his gaze deep into Enjolras' clear eyes, and appeared to grasp the latter's meaning. He smiled with a smile than which nothing was more disdainful, more energetic, and more resolute could be seen in the world, and replied with haughty gravity, "I see what it is. Well, yes. You are a police spy. I am an agent of the authorities. And your name?" "Javert." Enjolras made a sign to the four men. In the twinkling of an eye, before Javert had time to turn round, he was collared, thrown down, pinioned, and searched. They found on him a little round card, pasted between two pieces of glass, and bearing on one side the arms of France engraved, and with this motto, "Supervision and Vigilance," and on the other this note, "Javert, Inspector of Police, aged 52," and the signature of the prefect of police of that day, Monsieur Gisquet. Besides this, he had his watch and his purse, which contained several gold pieces. They left him his purse and his watch. Under the watch, at the bottom of his fob, they felt and seized a paper in an envelope, which Enjolras unfolded, and on which he read these 5 lines, written in the very hand of the prefect of police. "As soon as his political mission is accomplished, Inspector Javert will make sure, by special supervision, whether it is true that the malefactors have instituted intrigues on the right bank of the Seine near the Jena bridge." The search ended. They lifted Javert to his feet, bound his arms behind his back, and fastened him to that celebrated post in the middle of the room which had formerly given the wine shop its name. Gavroche, who had looked on at the whole of this scene, and had approved of everything, with a silent toss of his head, stepped up to Javert and said to him, "It's the mouse who has caught the cat." All this was so rapidly executed that it was all over when those about the wine shop noticed it. Javert had not uttered a single cry. At the sight of Javert bound to the post, Courfeyrac, Bossuet, Joly, Combeferre, and the man scattered over the 2 barricades came running up. Javert, with his back to the post, and so surrounded with ropes that he could not make a movement, raised his head with the intrepid serenity of the man who has never lied. "He is a police spy," said Enjolras, and turning to Javert, "You will be shot 10 minutes before the barricade is taken." Javert replied in his most imperious tone, "Why not at once?" "We are saving our powder." "Then finish the business with a blow of a knife." "Spy," said the handsome Enjolras, "we are judges and not assassins." Then he called Gavroche. "Here you, go about your business. Do what I told you." "I'm going," cried Gavroche. And halting as he was on the point of setting out, "By the way, you will give me his gun?" And he added, "I leave you the musician, but I want the clarinet." The gamin made the military salute, and passed gaily through the opening in the large barricade. Chapter 8. Many interrogation points with regard to a certain Le Cabuc, whose name may not have been Le Cabuc. The tragic picture which we have undertaken would not be complete. The reader would not see those grand moments of social birth pangs in a revolutionary birth, which contain convulsion mingled with effort, in their exact and real relief, were we to omit, in the sketch here outlined, an incident full of epic and savage horror, which occurred almost immediately after Gavroche's departure. Mobs, as the reader knows, are like a snowball, and collect as they roll along, a throng of tumultuous men. These men do not ask each other whence they come. Among the passers-by, who had joined the rabble led by Enjolras, Combeferre, and Courfeyrac, There had been a person wearing the jacket of a street porter, which was very threadbare on the shoulders, who gesticulated and vociferated, and who had the look of a drunken savage. This man, whose name or nickname was Le Cabuc, and who was, moreover, an utter stranger to those who pretended to know him, was very drunk, or assumed the appearance of being so, and had seated himself with several others at a table which they had dragged outside the wine shop. This Cabuc, while making those who vied with him drunk, seemed to be examining with a thoughtful air the large house at the extremity of the barricade, whose 5 stories commanded the whole street and faced the Rue Saint-Denis. All at once he exclaimed, "Do you know, comrades, it is from that house yonder that we must fire. When we are at the windows, the deuce is in it if anyone can advance into the street." "Yes, but the house is closed," said one of the drinkers. "Let us knock." "They will not open." "Let us break in the door." Le Cabuc runs to the door, which had a very massive knocker, and knocks. The door opens not. He strikes a second blow. No one answers. A third stroke. The same silence. "Is there anyone here?" shouts Cabuc. Nothing stirs. Then he seizes a gun and begins to batter the door with the butt end. It was an ancient alley door, low, vaulted, narrow, solid, entirely of oak, lined on the outside with a sheet of iron and iron stays, a genuine prison postern. The blows from the butt end of the gun made the house tremble, but did not shake the door. Nevertheless, it is probable that the inhabitants were disturbed, for a tiny square window was finally seen to open on the 3rd story, and at this aperture appeared the reverend and terrified face of a gray-haired old man who was the porter and who held a candle. The man who was knocking paused. "Gentlemen," said the porter, "what do you want?" "Open," said Cabuc. "That cannot be, gentlemen." "Open nevertheless." "Impossible, gentlemen." Le Cabuc took his gun and aimed at the porter, but as he was below, and as it was very dark, the porter did not see him. "Will you open, yes or no?" "No, gentlemen." "Do you say no?" "I say no, my good—" The porter did not finish. The shot was fired. The ball entered under his chin and came out at the nape of the neck after transversing the jugular vein. The old man fell back without a sigh. The candle fell and was extinguished, and nothing more was to be seen except a motionless head lying on the sill of the small window, and a little whitish smoke which floated off towards the roof. "There!" said Le Cabuc, dropping the butt end of his gun on the pavement. He had hardly uttered this word when he felt a hand laid on his shoulder with the weight of an eagle's talon, and he heard a voice saying to him, "On your knees." The murderer turned round and saw before him Enjolras' cold, white face. Enjolras held a pistol in his hand. He had hastened up at the sound of the discharge. He had seized Cabuc's collar, blouse, shirt, and suspender with his left hand. "On your knees," he repeated. And, with an imperious motion, the frail young man of 20 years bent the thick-set and sturdy porter like a reed, and brought him to his knees in the mire. Le Cabuc attempted to resist, but he seemed to have been seized by a superhuman hand. Enjolras, pale, with bare neck and dishevelled hair, and his woman's face, had about him at that moment something of the antique Themis. His dilated nostrils, his downcast eyes, gave to his implacable Greek profile that expression of wrath and that expression of chastity which, as the ancient world viewed the matter, befit justice. The whole barricade hastened up. Then all ranged themselves in a circle at a distance, feeling that it was impossible to utter a word in the presence of the thing which they were about to behold. Le Cabuc, vanquished, no longer tried to struggle and trembled in every limb. Enjolras released him and drew out his watch. "Collect yourself," said he. "Think or pray. You have 1 minute." "Mercy!" murmured the murderer. Then he dropped his head and stammered a few inarticulate oaths. Enjolras never took his eyes off him. He allowed a minute to pass. Then he replaced his watch in his fob. That done, he grasped Le Cabuc by the hair, as the latter coiled himself into a ball at his knees and shrieked, and placed the muzzle of the pistol to his ear. Many of those intrepid men who had so tranquilly entered upon the most terrible of adventures turned aside their heads. An explosion was heard. The assassin fell to the pavement, face downwards. Enjolras straightened himself up and cast a convinced and severe glance around him. Then he spurned the corpse with his foot and said, "Throw that outside." 3 men raised the body of the unhappy wretch, which was still agitated by the last mechanical convulsions of the life that had fled, and flung it over the little barricade of the Rue Mondétour. Enjolras was thoughtful. It was impossible to say what grandiose shadows slowly spread over his redoubtable serenity. All at once he raised his voice. A silence fell upon them. "Citizens!" said Enjolras, "what that man did was frightful. What I have done is horrible. He killed, therefore I killed him. I had to do it, because insurrection must have its discipline. Assassination is even more of a crime here than elsewhere. We are under the eyes of the Revolution. We are the priests of the Republic. We are the victims of duty, and must not be possible to slander our combat. I have, therefore, tried that man and condemned him to death. As for myself, constrained as I am to do what I have done, and yet abhorring it, I have judged myself also, and you shall soon see to what I have condemned myself." Those who listened to him shuddered. "We will share thy fate," cried Combeferre. "So be it," replied Enjolras. "One word more. In executing this man I have obeyed necessity, but necessity is a monster of the old world. Necessity's name is fatality. Now the law of progress is that monsters shall disappear before the angels, and that fatality shall vanish before fraternity. It is a bad moment to pronounce the word love. No matter, I do pronounce it, and I glorify it. Love, the future is thine. Death, I make use of thee, but I hate thee. Citizens, in the future there will be neither darkness nor thunderbolts, neither ferocious ignorance nor bloody retaliation. As there will be no more Satan, there will be no more Michael. In the future no one will kill anyone else. The earth will beam with radiance. The human race will love. The day will come, citizens, when all will be conquered, harmony, light, joy, and life. It will come, and it is in order that it may come that we are about to die." Enjolras ceased. His virgin lips closed, and he remained for some time standing on the spot where he had shed blood, in marble immobility. His staring eye caused those around him to speak in low tones. Jean Prouvaire and Combeferre pressed each other's hands silently, and, leaning against each other in an angle of the barricade, they watched with an admiration in which there was some compassion that grave young man, executioner and priest, composed of light, like crystal, and also of rock. Let us say at once that later on, after the action, when the bodies were taken to the morgue and searched, a police agent's card was found on Le Cabuc. The author of this book had in his hands, in 1848, the special report on this subject made to the prefect of police in 1832. We will add that if we are to believe a tradition of the police, which is strange but probably well-founded, Le Cabuc was claqué sous. The fact is that dating from the death of Le Cabuc, there was no longer any question of Claquesous. Claquesous had nowhere left any trace of his disappearance. He would seem to have amalgamated himself with the invisible. His life had been all shadows. His end was night. The whole insurgent group was still under the influence of the emotion of that tragic case, which had been so quickly tried and so quickly terminated, when Courfeyrac again beheld on the barricade the small young man who had inquired of him that morning for Marius. This lad, who had a bold and reckless air, had come by night to join the insurgents. End of Book 12, Chapter 8. End of Book 12. Corinth.
Chapter 1 of Book 13 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 13, Marius Enters the Shadow. Chapter 1, From the Rue Plumet to the Quartier Saint-Denis. The voice which had summoned Marius through the twilight of the barricade of the Rue de la Chanvrerie had produced on him the effect of the voice of destiny. He wished to die. The opportunity presented itself. He knocked at the door of the tomb. A hand in the darkness offered him the key. These melancholy openings which take place in the gloom before despair are tempting. Marius thrust aside the bar which had so often allowed him to pass, emerged from the garden, and said, "I will go." Mad with grief, no longer conscious of anything fixed or solid in his brain, incapable of accepting anything thenceforth of the fate after those 2 months passed in the intoxication of youth and love, overwhelmed at once by all the reveries of despair, he had but one desire remaining, to make a speedy end of all. He set out at rapid pace. He found himself most opportunely armed, as he had Javert's pistols with him. The young man of whom he thought he had caught a glimpse had vanished from his sight in the street. Marius, who had emerged from the Rue Plumet by the boulevard, traversed the Esplanade and the bridge of the Invalides, the Champs-Élysées, the Place Louis XV, and reached the Rue de Rivoli. The shops were open there. The gas was burning under the arcades. Women were making their purchases in the stalls. People were eating ices in the café latte and nibbling small cakes at the English pastry cook's shop. Only a few posting chaises were setting out at a gallop from the Hôtel des Princes and the Hôtel Meurice. Marius entered the Rue Saint-Honoré through the Passage Delorme. There the shops were closed. The merchants were chatting in front of their half-open doors. People were walking about. The street lanterns were lighted. Beginning with the first floor, all the windows were lighted as usual. There was cavalry on the Place du Palais Royal. Marius followed the Rue Saint-Honoré in proportion as he left the Palais Royal behind him. There were fewer lighted windows. The shops were fast shut. No one was chatting on the thresholds. The street grew sombre, and at the same time the crowd increased in density. For the passers-by now amounted to a crowd. No one could be seen to speak in this throng, and yet there arose from it a dull, deep murmur. Near the fountain of the Arbre Sec there were assemblages, motionless and gloomy groups, which were to those who went and came as stones in the midst of running water. At the entrance of the Rue des Prouvaires, the crowd no longer walked. It formed a resisting, massive, solid, compact, almost impenetrable block of people who were huddled together and conversing in low tones. There were hardly any black coats or round hats now, but smock frocks, blouses, caps, and bristling and cadaverous heads. This multitude undulated confusedly in the nocturnal gloom. Its whisperings had the hoarse accent of a vibration. Although not one of them was walking, a dull trampling was audible in the mire. Beyond this dense portion of the throng, in the Rue du Roule, and the Rue des Prouvaires, and the extension of the Rue Saint-Honoré, there were no longer a single window in which a candle was burning. Only the solitary and diminishing rows of lanterns could be seen vanishing into the street in the distance. The lanterns of that date resembled large red stars hanging to ropes and shed upon the pavement a shadow which had the form of a huge spider. These streets were not deserted. There could be descried piles of guns, moving bayonets, and troops bivouacking. No curious observer passed that limit. Their circulation ceased. There the rabble ended, and the army began. Marius willed with the will of a man who hopes no more. He had been summoned, he must go. He found a means to traverse the throng and pass the bivouac of the troops. He shunned the patrols, he avoided the sentinels, he made a circuit, reached the Rue de Bethisy, and directed his course toward the Halles. At the corner of the Rue des Bourdonnais, there were no longer any lanterns. After having passed the zone of the crowd, he had passed the limits of the troops. He found himself in something startling. There was no longer a passer-by, no longer a soldier, no longer a light. There was no one. Solitude, silence, night. I know not chill which seized upon one. Entering a street was like entering a cellar. He continued to advance. He took a few steps. Someone passed close to him at a run. Was it a man or a woman? Were there many of them? He could not have told. It had passed and vanished. Proceeding from circuit to circuit, he reached a lane which he judged to be the Rue de la Poterie. Near the middle of this street he came in contact with an obstacle. He extended his hands. It was an overturned wagon. His foot recognized pools of water, gullies, and paving stones scattered and piled up. A barricade had been begun there and abandoned. He climbed over the stones and found himself on the other side of the barrier. He walked very near the street posts and guided himself along the walls of the houses. A little beyond the barricade, it seemed to him that he could make out something white in front of him. He approached. It took on a form. It was 2 white horses, the horses of the omnibus, harnessed by Bossuet in the morning, who had been straying at random all day from the street to street, and had finally halted there, with the weary patience of brutes who no more understand the actions of men than man understands the actions of Providence. Marius left the horses behind him. As he was approaching a street, which seemed to him to be the Rue du Centre Social, a shot, coming no one knows whence, and traversing the darkness at random, whistled close by him, and the bullet pierced a brass shaving-dish suspended above his head over a hairdresser's shop. This pierced shaving-dish was still to be seen in 1848 in the Rue du Centre Social, at the corner of the pillars of the market. This shot still betokened life. From that instant forth he encountered nothing more. The whole of this itinerary resembled a descent of black steps. Nevertheless, Marius pressed forward. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. An Owl's View of Paris. A being who could have hovered over Paris that night with the wing of the bat or of the owl would have had beneath his eyes a gloomy spectacle. All that old quarter of the Halles, which is like a city within a city, through which run the Rue Saint-Denis and Saint-Martin, where 1,000 lanes cross, and of which the insurgents had made their redoubt and their stronghold, would have appeared to him like a dark and enormous cavity hollowed out in the centre of Paris. There the glance fell into an abyss. Thanks to the broken lanterns, thanks to the closed windows, there all radiance, all life, all sound, all movement ceased. The invisible police of the insurrection were on the watch everywhere, and maintained order, that is to say, night. The necessary tactics of insurrection are to drown small numbers in a vast obscurity, to multiply every combatant by the possibilities which that obscurity contains. At dusk, every window where a candle was burning received a shot. The light was extinguished. Sometimes the inhabitant was killed. Hence, nothing was stirring. There was nothing but fright, mourning, stupor in the houses, and in the streets a sort of sacred horror. Not even the long rows of windows in stores, the indentations of the chimneys and the roofs, and the vague reflections which are cast back by the wet and muddy pavements were visible. An eye cast upward at that mass of shadows might, perhaps, have caught a glimpse here and there, at intervals, of indistinct gleams which brought out broken and eccentric lines and profiles of singular buildings, something like the lights which go and come in ruins. It was at such points that the barricades were situated. The rest was a lake of obscurity, foggy, heavy, and funereal, above which, in motionless and melancholy outlines, rose the tower of Saint-Jacques, and the church of Sainte-Marie, and two or three more of those grand edifices of which man makes giants, and the night makes phantoms. All around this deserted and disquieting labyrinth, in the quarters where the Parisian circulation had not been annihilated, and where a few street lanterns still burned, the aerial observer might have distinguished the metallic gleam of swords and bayonets, the dull rumble of artillery, and the swarming of silent battalions whose ranks were swelling from minute to minute, a formidable girdle which was slowly drawing in and around the insurrection. The invested quarter was no longer anything more than a monstrous cavern. Everything there appeared to be asleep or motionless, and as we have just seen, any street which one might come to offered nothing but darkness. A wild darkness, full of traps, full of unseen and formidable shocks, into which it was alarming to penetrate, and in which it was terrible to remain, where those who entered shivered before those they awaited, where those who waited shuddered before those who were coming. Invisible combatants were entrenched at every corner of the street. Snares of the sepulchre were concealed in the density of night. All was over. No more light was to be hoped for. Henceforth, except the lightning of guns, no further encounter except the abrupt and rapid apparition of death. Where, how, when, no one knew, but it was certain and inevitable. In this place, which had been marked out for the struggle, the government and the insurrection, the National Guard and popular societies, the bourgeois and the uprising, groping their way, were about to come into contact. The necessity was the same for both. The only possible issue thenceforth was to emerge thence killed or conquerors. A situation so extreme, an obscurity so powerful, that the most timid felt themselves seized with resolution, and the most daring with terror. Moreover, on both sides, the fury, the rage, and the determination were equal. For the one party to advance meant death, and no one dreamed of retreating. For the other, to remain meant death, and no one dreamed of flight. It was indispensable that all should be ended on the following day, that triumph should rest either here or there, that the insurrection should prove itself a revolution or a skirmish. The government understood this as well as the parties. The most insignificant bourgeois felt it. Hence a thought of anguish, which mingled with the impenetrable gloom of this quarter where all was at the point of being decided. Hence a redoubled anxiety around the silence whence a catastrophe was on the point of emerging. Here only one sound was audible, a sound as heart-rending as the death rattle, as menacing as a malediction, the tocsin of Sainte-Marie. Nothing could be more blood-curdling than the clamour of the wild and desperate bell, wailing amid the shadows. As it often happens, nature seemed to have fallen into accord with what men were about to do. Nothing disturbed the harmony of the whole effect. The stars had disappeared. Heavy clouds filled the horizon with their melancholy folds. A black sky rested on these dead streets, as though an immense winding sheet were being outspread over this immense tomb. while a battle that was still wholly political was in preparation in the same locality which had already witnessed so many revolutionary events, while youth, the secret associations, the schools in the name of principles, and the middle classes in the name of interest, were approaching preparatory to dashing themselves together, clasping and throwing each other, while each one hastened and invited the last and decisive hour of the crisis. Far away, and quite outside of this fatal quarter, in the most profound depths of the unfathomable cavities of that wretched old Paris, which disappears under the splendor of happy and opulent Paris, the sombre voice of the people could be heard giving utterance to a dull roar. A fearful and sacred voice, which is composed of the roar of the brute and of the word of God, which terrifies the weak and warns the wise, which comes both from below like the voice of the lion, and from on high like the voice of the thunder. End of Book 13, Chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 3 of Book 13 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 13, Marius enters the shadow. Chapter 3, Marius had reached the Halles. There everything was still calmer, more obscure and more motionless than in the neighboring streets. One would have said that the glacial peace of the sepulchre had sprung forth from the earth, and had spread over the heavens. Nevertheless, a red glow brought out against this black background the lofty roofs of the houses which barred the Rue de la Chanvrerie on the Saint Eustache side. It was the reflection of the torch which was burning in the Corinth barricade. Marius directed his steps toward that red light. It had drawn him to the Marshal Pourri, and he caught a glimpse of the dark mouth of the Rue des Prêcheurs. He entered it. The insurgent sentinel who was guarding the other end did not see him. He felt that he was very close to that which he had come in search of, and he walked on tiptoe. In this manner he reached the elbow of that short section of the Rue Mondétour, which was, as the reader will remember, the only communication which Enjolras had preserved with the outside world. At the corner of the last house on his left, he thrust his head forward and looked into the fragment of the Rue Mondétour. A little beyond the angle of the lane and the Rue de la Chanvrerie, which cast a broad curtain of shadow, in which he was himself engulfed, he perceived some light on the pavement, a bit of the wine shop, and beyond, a flickering lamp within a sort of shapeless wall, and men crouching down with guns on their knees. All this was 10 fathoms distant from him. It was the interior of the barricade. The houses which bordered the lane on the right concealed the rest of the wine shop, the large barricade, and the flag from him. Marius had but a step more to take. Then the unhappy man seated himself on a post, folded his arms, and fell to thinking about his father. He thought of that heroic Colonel Pontmercy, who had been so proud a soldier, who had guarded the frontier of France under the Republic, and had touched the frontier of Asia under Napoleon, who had beheld Genoa, Alexandria, Milan, Turin, Madrid, Vienna, Dresden, Berlin, Moscow, who had left on all the victorious battlefields of Europe drops of that same blood which he, Marius, had in his veins, who had grown gray before his time in discipline and command, who had lived with his sword belt buckled, his epaulets falling on his breast, his cockade blackened with powder, his brow furrowed with his helmet, in barracks, in camp, in the bivouac, in ambulances, and who, at the expiration of 20 years, had returned from the great wars with a scarred cheek, a smiling countenance, tranquil, admirable, pure as a child, having done everything for France, and nothing against her. He said to himself that his day had also come now, that his hour had struck, that, following his father, he too was about to show himself brave, intrepid, bold, to run to meet the bullets, to offer his breast to bayonets, to shed his blood, to seek the enemy, to seek death, that he was about to wage war in his turn and descend to the field of battle, and that the field of battle upon which he was to descend was the street, and that the war in which he was about to engage was civil war. He beheld civil war laid open like a gulf before him, and into this he was about to fall. Then he shuddered. He thought of his father's sword, which his grandfather had sold to a second-hand dealer, and which he had so mournfully regretted. He said to himself that that chaste and valiant sword had done well to escape from him, and to depart in wrath into the gloom, that if it had thus fled, it was because it was intelligent, and because it had foreseen the future, that it had had a presentiment of this rebellion, the war of the gutters, the war of pavements, fusillades through cellar windows, blows given and received in the rear. It was because, coming from Marengo and Friedland, it did not wish to go to the Rue de la Chanvrerie. It was because, after what it had done with the father, it did not wish to do this for the son. He told himself that if that sword were there, if after taking possession of it at his father's pillow, he had dared to take it and carry it off for this combat of darkness between Frenchmen in the streets, it would assuredly have scorched his hands and burst out of flame before his eyes, like the sword of the angel. He told himself that it was fortunate that it was not there, that it had disappeared, that that was well, that that was just, that his grandfather had been the true guardian of his father's glory, and that it was far better that the colonel's sword should be sold at auction, sold to the old clothes man, thrown among the old junk, than it should today wound the side of his country. And then he fell to weeping bitterly. This was horrible. But what was he to do? Live without Cosette he could not. Since she was gone, he must needs die. Had he not given her his word of honor that he would die? She had gone knowing that. This meant that it pleased her that Marius should die, and then it was clear that she no longer loved him, since she had departed thus without warning, without a word, without a letter, although she knew his address. What was the good of living, and why should he live now? Then what? Should he retreat after going so far? Should he flee from danger after having approached it? Should he slip away after having come and peeped into the barricade? Slip away, all in a tremble, saying, "After all, I have had enough of it as it is. I have seen it. That suffices. This is civil war, and I shall take my leave." Should he abandon his friends who were expecting, who were in need of him possibly, who were a mere handful against an army? Should he be untrue at once to his love, to country, to his word? Should he give to his cowardice the pretext of patriotism? But this was impossible. And if the phantom of his father was there in the gloom and beheld him retreating, he would beat him on the loins with the flat of his sword and shout to him, "March on, you poltroon!" Thus, a prey to the conflicting movements of his thoughts, he dropped his head. All at once he raised it. A sort of splendid rectification had just been effected in his mind. There is a widening of the sphere of thought which is peculiar to the vicinity of the grave. It makes one see clearly to be near death. The vision of the action into which he felt that he was, perhaps, on the point of entering, appeared to him no more as lamentable, but as superb. The war of the street was suddenly transfigured by some unfathomable inward working of his soul, before the eye of his thought. All the tumultuous interrogation points of reverie recurred to him in throngs, but without troubling him. He left none of them unanswered. Let us see. Why should his father be indignant? Are there not cases where insurrection rises to the dignity of duty? What was there that was degrading for the son of Colonel Pontmercy in the combat which was about to begin? It is no longer Montmirail nor Champaubert. It is something quite different. The question is no longer one of sacred territory, but of a holy idea. The country wails, that may be, but humanity applauds. But is it true that the country does wail? France bleeds, but liberty smiles, and in the presence of liberty's smile, France forgets her wound. And then, if we look at things from a still more lofty point of view, why do we speak of civil war? Civil war, what does that mean? Is there a foreign war? Is not all war between men war between brothers? War is qualified only by its object. There is no such thing as foreign or civil war. There is only just and unjust war. Until that day when the grand human agreement is concluded, war, that at least which is the effort of the future, which is hastening on against the past, which is lagging in the rear, may be necessary. What have we to reproach that war with? War does not become a disgrace. The sword does not become a disgrace, except when it is used for assassinating the right, progress, reason, civilization, truth. Then war, whether foreign or civil, is iniquitous. It is called crime. Outside the pale of that holy thing, justice, by what right does one form of man despise another? By what right should the sword of Washington disown the pike of Camille Desmoulins? Leonidas against the stranger, Timoleon against the tyrant, which is greater? The one is the defender, the other the liberator. Shall we brand every appeal to arms within a city limits without taking the object into a consideration? Then note the infamy of Brutus, Marcel, Arnold von Blankenheim, calling the hedgerow war, war of the streets. Why not? That was the war of Ambiorix, of Artevelde, of Marny, of Pelagius. But Ambiorix fought against Rome, Artevelde against France, Marny against Spain, Pelagius against the Moors, all against the foreigner. Well, the monarchy is a foreigner. Oppression is a stranger. The right divine is a stranger. Despotism violates the moral frontier, and invasion violates geographical frontier. Driving out the tyrant or driving out the English, in both cases regaining possession of one's own territory. There comes an hour when protestation no longer suffices. After philosophy, action is required. Live force finishes what the idea has sketched out. Prometheus chained begins. Aristotegan begins. The encyclopedian lightens souls. The 10th of August electrifies them. After Aeschylus, Thrasybulus. After Diderot, Danton. Multitudes have a tendency to accept the master. Their mass bears witness to apathy. A crowd is easily led as a whole to obedience. Men must be stirred up, pushed on, treated roughly by the very benefit of their deliverance. Their eyes must be wounded by the true. Light must be hurled at them in terrible handfuls. They must be a little thunderstruck themselves at their own well-being. This dazzling awakens them. Hence the necessity of tocsins and wars. Great combatants must rise, must enlighten nations with audacity, and shake up that sad humanity which is covered with gloom by the right divine, Caesarean glory, force, fanaticism, irresponsible power, and absolute majesty. A rabble stupidly occupied in the contemplation, in their twilight splendor, of these sombre triumphs of the night. Down with the tyrant! Of whom are you speaking? Do you call Louis Philippe the tyrant? No, no more than Louis XVI. Both of them are what history is in the habit of calling good kings. But principles are not to be parcelled out. The logic of the true is rectilinear. The peculiarity of truth is that it lacks complacence. No concessions. Then all encroachments on man should be repressed. There is a divine right in Louis XVI. There is because of Bourbon in Louis Philippe. Both represent in a certain measure the confiscation of right. And in order to clear away universal insurrection, they must be combated. It must be done, France being always the one to begin. When the master falls in France, he falls everywhere. In short, What cause is more just, and consequently what war is greater than that which reestablishes social truth, restores throne to liberty, restores the people to the people, restores sovereignty to man, replaces the purple on the head of France, restores equity and reason in their plenitude, suppresses every germ of antagonism by restoring each one to himself, annihilates the obstacle which royalty presents to the whole immense universal concord, and places the human race once more on a level with the right. These wars build up peace, an enormous fortress of prejudices, privileges, superstitions, lies, exactions, abuses, violences, iniquities, and darkness still stand erect in this world with its towers of hatred. It must be cast down. This monstrous mass must be made to crumble. To conquer at Austerlitz is grand. To take the Bastille is immense. There is no one who has not noticed it in his own case, the soul, and therein lies the marvel of its unity complicated with ubiquity, has a strange aptitude for reasoning almost coldly in the most violent extremities, and it often happens that heart-broken passion and profound despair in the very agony of their blackest monologues treat subjects and discuss theses. Logic is mingled with convulsion, and the thread of syllogism floats, without breaking, in the mournful storm of thought. This was the situation of Marius' mind. As he meditated thus, dejected but resolute, hesitating in every direction, and in short shuddering at what he was about to do, his glance strayed to the interior of the barricade. The insurgents were there, conversing in a low voice, without moving, and there was perceptible that quasi-silence which marks the last stage of expectation. Overhead, at the small window in the third story, Marius descried a sort of spectator who appeared to him to be singularly attentive. This was the porter who had been killed by Le Cabuc. Below, by the lights of the torch which was thrust between the paving stones, this head could be vaguely distinguished. Nothing could be stranger in that sombre and uncertain gleam than that vivid, motionless, astonished face, with its bristling hair, its eyes fixed and staring, and its yawning mouth bent over the street in an attitude of curiosity. One would have said that the man who was dead was surveying those who were about to die. A long trail of blood which had flowed from that head descended in reddish threads from the window to the height of the first floor, where it stopped. End of Book 13, Chapter 3.
Chapter 1 of Book 14 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabella Florence Hapgood. Book 14, The Grandeurs of Despair. Chapter 1, The Flag, Act First. As yet nothing had come. 10 o'clock had sounded from St. Mary. Enjolras and Combeferre had gone and seated themselves, carbines in hand, near the outlet of the grand barricade. They no longer addressed each other. They listened, seeking to catch even the faintest and most distant sound of marching. Suddenly, in the midst of the dismal calm, a clear, gay young voice, which seemed to come from the Rue Saint-Denis, rose and began to sing distinctly to the old popular air of By the Light of the Moon. This bit of poetry terminated by a cry like the crow of a cock. Monets est la mer, mon ami Begad, prête-moi tes grandes armes pour lire dire un mot, en capote bleue, le poule au shako, voici la benlioule, cocorico. They pressed each other's hands. That is Gavroche, said Enjolras. He is warning us, said Combeferre. A hasty rush troubled the deserted street. They beheld a being more agile than a clown climb over the omnibus, and Gavroche bounded into the barricade, all breathless, saying, "My gun! Here they are!" An electric quiver shot through the whole barricade, and the sound of hands seeking their guns became audible. "Would you like my carbine?" said Enjolras to the lad. "I want a big gun," replied Gavroche, and he seized Javert's gun. 2 sentinels had fallen back and had come in almost at the same moment as Gavroche. They were the sentinels from the end of the street and the vide of the Rue de la Petite Trondière. The vidette of the Lane des Prêcheurs had remained at his post, which indicated that nothing was approaching from the direction of the bridges and halls. The Rue de la Chanvrerie, of which a few paving stones alone were dimly visible in the reflection of the light projected on the flag, offered to the insurgents the aspect of a vast black door vaguely opened into a smoke. Each man had taken up his position for the conflict. 43 insurgents, among whom were Enjolras, Combeferre, Courfeyrac, Bossuet, Joly, Barrol, and Gavroche, were kneeling inside the large barricade, with their heads on a level with the crest of the barrier, the barrels of their guns and carbines aimed on the stones as though at loopholes, attentive, mute, ready to fire. 6, commanded by Feuilly, had installed themselves with their guns leveled at their shoulders at the windows of the 2 stories of Corinth. Several minutes passed thus. Then a sound of footsteps, measured, heavy, and numerous, became distinctly audible in the direction of St. Leu. This sound, faint at first, then precise, then heavy and sonorous, approached slowly, without halt, without intermission, with a tranquil and terrible continuity. Nothing was to be heard but this. It was that combined silence and sound of the statue of the commander, but this stony step had something indescribably enormous and multiple about it, which awakened the idea of a throng, and at the same time the idea of a spectre. One thought one heard the terrible state legion marching onward. This tread drew near, it drew still nearer and stopped. It seemed as though the breathing of many men could be heard at the end of the street. Nothing was to be seen, however, but at the bottom of that dense obscurity there could be distinguished a multitude of metallic threads, as fine as needles and almost imperceptible, which moved about like those indescribable phosphoric networks which one sees beneath one's closed eyelids in the first mists of slumber at the moment when one is dropping off to sleep. These were bayonets and gun barrels confusedly illuminated by the distant reflection of the torch. A pause ensued, as though both sides were waiting. All at once, from the depths of the darkness, a voice, which was all the more sinister since no one was visible, and which appeared to be the gloom itself speaking, shouted, "Who goes there?" At the same time, the click of guns, as they were lowered into position, was heard. Enjolras replied in a haughty and vibrating tone, "The French Revolution!" "Fire!" shouted the voice. A flash empurpled all the facades in the street, as though the door of a furnace had been flung open and hastily closed again. A fearful detonation burst forth on the barricade. The red flag fell. The discharge had been so violent and so dense that it cut the staff, that is to say, the very tip of the omnibus pole. Bullets which had rebounded from the cornices of the houses penetrated the barricade and wounded several men. The impression produced by this first discharge was freezing. The attack had been rough and of a nature to inspire reflection in the boldest. It was evident that they had to deal with an entire regiment at the very least. "Comrades!" shouted Courfeyrac, "let us not waste our powder. Let us wait until they are in the street before replying. And above all," said Enjolras, "let us raise the flag again." He picked up the flag, which had fallen precisely at his feet. Outside, the clatter of the ramrods in the guns could be heard. The troops were reloading their arms. Enjolras went on, "Who is there here with a bold heart? Who will plant the flag on the barricade again?" Not a man responded. To mount on the barricade at the very moment when, without any doubt, it was again the object of their aim, was simply death. The bravest hesitated to pronounce his own condemnation. Enjolras himself felt a thrill. He repeated, "Does no one volunteer?" Chapter 2. The Flag, Act 2. Since they had arrived at Corinth, and had begun the construction of the barricade, no attention had been paid to Father Mabeuf. Monsieur Mabeuf had not quitted the mob, however. He had entered the ground floor of the wine-shop, and had seated himself behind the counter. There he had, so to speak, retreated into himself. He no longer seemed to look or to think. Courfeyrac and the others had accosted him 2 or 3 times, warning him of his peril, beseeching him to withdraw, but he did not hear them. When they were not speaking to him, his mouth moved as though he were replying to someone, and as soon as he was addressed, his lips became motionless, and his eyes no longer had the appearance of being alive. Several hours before the barricade was attacked, he had assumed an attitude which he did not afterwards abandon, with both fists planted on his knees, and his head thrust forward as though he were gazing over a precipice. Nothing had been able to move him from this attitude. It did not seem as though his mind were in the barricade. When each had gone to take up his position for the combat, there remained in the tap-room where Javert was bound to the post only a single insurgent with a naked sword watching over Javert and himself, Mabeuf. At the moment of the attack, at the detonation, the physical shock had reached him and had, as it were, awakened him. He started up abruptly, crossed the room, and at the instant when Enjolras repeated his appeal, "Does no one volunteer?" the old man was seen to make his appearance on the threshold of the wine-shop. His presence produced a sort of commotion in the different groups. A shout went up. "It is the voter! It is the member of the convention! It is the representative of the people!" It is probable that he did not hear them. He strode straight up to Enjolras, the insurgents withdrawing before him with a religious fear. He tore the flag from Enjolras, who recoiled in amazement, and then, since no one dared to stop or to assist him, this old man of 80, with shaking head but firm foot, began slowly to ascend the staircase of paving stones arranged in the barricade. This was so melancholy and so grand that all around him cried, "Off with your hats!" At every step that he mounted, it was a frightful spectacle. His white locks, his decrepit face, his lofty, bald, and wrinkled brow, his amazed and open mouth, his aged arm upholding the red banner, rose through the gloom and were enlarged in the bloody light of the torch, and the bystanders thought that they beheld the spectre of '93 emerging from the earth with a flag of terror in his hand. When he reached the last step, when this trembling and terrible phantom, erect on that pile of rubbish, in the presence of 1,200 invisible guns, drew himself up in the face of death, as though he were more powerful than it, the whole barricade assumed amid the darkness a supernatural and colossal form. There ensued one of those silences which occur only in the presence of prodigies. In the midst of this silence the old man waved the red flag and shouted, "Long live the Revolution! Long live the Republic! Fraternity! Equality! And death!" Those in the barricade heard a low and rapid whisper, like the murmur of a priest who is dispatching a prayer in haste. It was probably the commissary of police who was making the legal summons at the other end of the street. Then the same piercing voice which had shouted, "Who goes there?" shouted, "Retire!" Monsieur Mabeuf, pale, haggard, his eyes lighted up with the mournful flame of aberration, raised the flag above his head and repeated, "Long live the Republic!" "Fire!" said the voice. A second discharge, similar to the first, rained down upon the barricade. The old man fell on his knees, then rose again, dropped the flag, and fell backward on the pavement, like a log at full length with outstretched arms. Rivulets of blood flowed beneath him. His aged head, pale and sad, seemed to be gazing at the sky. One of those emotions which are superior to man, which make him forget even to defend himself, seized upon the insurgents, and they approached the body with a respectful awe. "What men these regicides were," said Enjolras. Courfeyrac bent down to Enjolras' ear. "This is for yourself alone. I do not wish to dampen the enthusiasm, but this man was anything rather than a regicide. I knew him. His name was Father Mabeuf. I do not know what was the matter with him today, but he was a brave blockhead. Just look at his head." "The head of a blockhead and the heart of a Brutus," replied Enjolras. Then he raised his voice. "Citizens, this is the example which the old give to the young. We hesitate, he came. We were drawing back, he advanced. This is what those who are trembling with age teach to those who tremble with fear. This aged man is august in the eyes of his country. He has had a long life and a magnificent death. Now let us place the body under cover, that each one of us may defend this old man, dead as he would his father living, and may his presence in our midst render the barricade impregnable." A murmur of gloomy and energetic assent followed these words. Enjolras bent down, raised the old man's head, and fierce as he was, he kissed him on the brow. Then, throwing wide his arms, and handling this dead man with tender precaution, as though he feared to hurt it, he removed his coat, showed the bloody holes in it to all, and said, "This is our flag now." End of Book 14, Chapters 1 and 2.